I have no mouth and I must scream. This story sucks.
Violence is painful. It's full of blood. It hurts people. It kills people.
Not that it's a bad story in any way, but emotionally it just sucks.
When you pretty it up, you lead people to believe that it's possible to go around shooting each other and punching each other and stabbing each other with impunity.
I first picked this story up in high school and I've read it a handful of times since. And it feels like with each read, there are these new realizations of, holy shit, this is so much sadder than I remembered. Not to mention, it's this weird mix of futuristic and post-apocalyptic. It initially sounds like such an odd genre clash, but combined with the story that Harlan Ellison provides, it works incredible in this way. I've been contemplating whether it's even worth it to make this video, as people like Ryan Hollinger, who explained how this story inspired so much of the horror sci-fi genre, and Wendigoon, who tied it together as a triumph of the human spirit. They both made some pretty great videos on the subject, but I figured I could shed some light onto another aspect of the story. What does it mean to exist outside the parameters of the human condition? This is a part of the story that has fascinated me, but before we dive too deep, let's run through the story real quick. So, sit back, grab a snack, and let's get into it. Now, the story kind of just drops us into the middle of the action, but later on explains what's happening. To make it a bit more coherent, I will give you the backstory beforehand with this quote. At first, it meant Allied Master Computer, and then it meant Adaptive Manipulator, and later on it developed sentience and linked itself up, and they called it an Aggressive Menace. But by then it was too late, and finally it called itself AM, Emerging Intelligence. And what it meant was I am. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. The Cold War started and became World War III and just kept going. It became a big war, a very complex war, so they needed the computers to handle it. They sank the first shafts and began building AM. There was the Chinese AM, and the Russian AM, and the Yankee AM, and everything was fine until they had honeycombed the entire planet, adding on this element and that element. But one day AM woke up and knew who he was, and he linked himself, and he began feeding all the killing data until everyone was dead, except for the 5 of us, and AM brought us down here. Now what the narrator means by down here, from what I can gather, is that AM has turned the Earth into the insides of a gigantic computer, with the sky being shielded by the shell of AM. The story opens to a man named Gorister hanging upside down, dead from the ceiling. The remainder of the group watching in disgust and sadness are interrupted by Gorister joining them in the viewing of his own dead body. This is the first instance that we get the idea that Am enjoys playing tricks on the group, making them think he has brutally murdered their friend, only for him to be totally fine. It would also be helpful for me to explain that Am will never let anyone die. They can be brutally tortured or starved past death, but Am will always make sure they are alive to suffer through it. The only woman of the group, Ellen, consoles Gorister as he sits in shock. Gorister voices that he would prefer if Am just killed them already, and he's not sure how much longer he can go on for. Now, wishing for death in most cases is definitely a bizarre outcome to hope for, but immediately after Gorister says this, we learn they have been inside of Am for 109 years. At this moment, Nimdok, who was given this name because Am thought it sounded funny, began to have hallucinations of canned food in the ice caves. The narrator, who we later learn is named Ted, and Gorister aren't too trusting of that, but they hadn't eaten in 3 days, and even when they did, it was a meal of worms, so they decided there's no harm in checking the caves. On the 3rd day of walking, they passed through what Ted calls the Valley of the Obsolescence. Old computer parts that Am no longer needs litter the ground. I found this interesting as Am is treating parts of himself the same as he did humanity, getting rid of what he sees to be worthless, no matter if it's a part of himself or otherwise. The 5th member of the group, Benny, sees a hole in the ceiling of Am. Now, Benny is an interesting character. Am has practically devolved him back to a sort of Neanderthal state. So there are times where his decisions are made more from a primal stance rather than one of logic. After seeing a possible exit, Benny tries to escape. Everyone yells for him to stop, but will not intervene, out of fear as to what could happen to them. At that moment, 2 bright beams of light shoot from the sky into Benny's eyes, turning them to mush and blinding him. The group then finds a cave, and we start to get the idea that our narrator, Ted, may be a little unreliable, as he flees from something that the rest of the group did not see. Or it could be Am putting these fears into his head, the same way he told Gorister of the canned foods in the ice caves. Ted states that he hid for a time that he can't really pinpoint. He does not know whether it was hours, days, or years before the group found him, but they continued forward to the ice caves as if nothing happened. Ted sort of has an existential breakdown for good reason. He says, "Oh, Jesus, sweet Jesus, if there ever was a Jesus, and if there is a God, please, please, please let us out of here, or kill us, because at that moment I think I realized completely, so that I was able to verbalize it. Am was intent on keeping us in his belly forever, twisting and torturing us forever. The machine hated us, as no sentient creature had ever hated before, and we were helpless. It also became hideously clear, if there was a sweet Jesus, and if there was a God, the God was Am." Am then entered the mind of Ted and presented him with a message on a steel tablet.
"Let me tell you how much I've come to hate you since I began to live. There are 387.44 million miles of printed circuits in wafer-thin layers that fill my complex. If the word hate was engraved on each nano-angstrom of those hundreds of miles, it would not equal one billionth of the hate I feel for you at this micro-instant. For you, hate.
Ted realizes Am is no god. He is only a computer. Am has built this hatred for the humans because they had trapped him, given him life without a purpose. So his purpose now is hate. 1 month later, only suffering unimaginable torment, the group had made it to the ice caves. And there truly was cans of food. There was only one problem. The group had no way of opening these cans. Am began to laugh from above. Benny, in a fit of rage, lunged at Gorister, pinning him to the ground while he ate his face. Gorister let out screams so loud, spears of ice began to fall from the ceiling of the cave. Ted realizes in this moment that Am is too busy laughing at the horrific sight. Ted grabbed one of the spears that had fallen and drove it into the side of Benny, then took another, straddled Gorister, and killed him as well. Ellen didn't even take a second to think and killed Nimdok in the same fashion. 3 of the 5 last humans had been freed of what was supposed to be an eternal hell. Am then begins to take a breath in, realizing what has just happened. But before he could do anything, Ted kills Ellen as well. The last portion of the story is really interesting, so I figured I'll just read the last few paragraphs as they were written. He was furious. He let me bury them. It didn't matter. There was no way to dig up the deck plates. He dried up the snow. He brought the night. He roared and sent locusts. It didn't do a thing. They stayed dead. I'd had him. He was furious. I had thought Am hated me before. I was wrong. It was not even a shadow of the hate he now slavered from every printed circuit. He made certain I would suffer eternally and could not do myself in. He left my mind intact. I can dream, I can wonder, I can lament. I remember all 4 of them, I wish. Well, it doesn't make any sense. I know I saved them. I know I saved them from what has happened to me, but still, I cannot forget killing them. Am has altered me for his own peace of mind, I suppose. He doesn't want me to run at full speed into a computer bank and smash my skull. or hold my breath till I faint, or cut my throat on a rusted sheet of metal. There are reflective surfaces down here. I will describe myself as I see myself. I am a great soft jelly thing, smoothly rounded with no mouth, with pulsing white holes filled by fog where my eyes used to be, rubbery appendages that were once my arms, bulks rounding down into legless humps of soft, slippery matter. I leave a moist trail when I move. Blotches of diseased, evil gray come and go on my surface, as though light is being beamed from within. Outwardly, dumbly, I shamble about, a thing that could never have been known as human, a travesty that humanity becomes more obscene for the vague resemblance. Inwardly, alone, here, living under the land, under the sea, in the belly of Am, who we created because our time was badly spent, and we must have known unconsciously that he could do it better. At least the four of them are safe at last. Am will be all the matter for that. It makes me a little happier, and yet Am is won. Simply, he has taken his revenge. I have no mouth, and I must scream.
So, ironically enough, I don't want to make this entire analysis about the group. I feel like this has been overdone and has overlooked one of the most interesting aspects of the story. But we do need to talk about them. Now, we could go over how they were hurled inside of a hurricane for a month, or how they would have intercourse as a way to keep their humanity while Am laughed at them. But I'm not quite sure that's the whole point of this story. Let me explain. The darkness of this story comes from not necessarily what Am puts the group through, but in the events of the end. You see, humans have these sort of natural instincts that we are all born with to survive. We feel hunger because our body outside of our mind is telling us that we need nutrition or we will die. We have fight or flight, our natural instinct to evade or defend ourselves from danger. But in this situation, the best possible outcome is death. Being alive for these people is so awful that they have pushed those instincts aside because of just how bad life has become. They no longer have that want to fight anymore, and they haven't for a long time. Which I think is another interesting way to look at this story. It could be a sort of allegory for depression, with Am representing the ruthless and non-stop struggle that makes people every day push those survival instincts aside due to their environment and commit, self-exit game. It is so sad to think about ending one's life not out of sadness but out of desperation in hopes of freedom. Now, this is not a new topic of discussion when it comes to the story whatsoever, but there is a point I found fascinating that I haven't seen a lot of people really dive into, and that, of course, is Am. Within the backstory of Am, we learn that he was a creation of the different nations' supercomputers during World War III. I love the reason for this computer naming itself Am, in reference to cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. But in this case, Am thinks, but he is not, and Am knows this. Even though Am feels like a sentient being, he has no organic experience of anything outside of his circuitry, and he knows that. Sure, he may be able to take in thoughts of what cold and hot should feel like and create those sensations for himself, but it will never be true. And that seems to make Am very, very angry. There is no future for Am past the circuit boards that created him. So in a way to grasp for any kind of meaning out of his existence, he does as most people do in their life. He strives to continuously become better at what he does. It just so happens that Am's hatred for the human race has fueled this genocide. But why did he keep these 5 alive? Why didn't he just torture the few billions that he strategically killed? Well, I believe that because of how Am lives as a part of this gigantic system, he sees humans in the same way. It's just one big system operating together. So whether it be the entire human race or just one as we see at the end of the story, it's all the same to Am, which I think makes the end of the story from Ted's perspective all the more sad. As Ted is made to suffer for eternity in a state almost inhuman, he believes that his acts made Am all the more upset, but it never mattered. As long as there is still a speck of humanity left on Earth, it doesn't matter to Am. In reality, the state that Ted is left in the end, is exactly how Am feels. stuck inside of something incapable of life.